Hello and welcome to this video. Today we're going to discuss how to use Bootstrap to create your HTML and CSS for your web application. Now that we're ready, let's get started. So the first thing we're going to need to do is go to getbootstrap.com. Now Bootstrap, and the reason why we're using Bootstrap, is just a HTML and CSS framework. So what this means to us is that we can take advantage of CSS and HTML elements that have already been programmed, and we can build our applications not only quicker but also so they are cross-browser compatible. That means that we can use them in Chrome, Firefox, Internet Explorer, Edge and any other browser usually. Being HTML and CSS based, that means that we do not need anything special in order for us to work with Bootstrap. There are different ways that we can download Bootstrap. The reason why we're going for the source files is because we want an unminified version. Now, in terms of minification, what that means to us is that if we were to show you a CSS file or HTML file on the screen, you'd notice that you'd see different lines in there. So you'd have, for example, an opening P tag for a paragraph and a closing P tag, possibly on separate lines. Minification just removes all those spaces, all those blank lines, or anything that could be construed as being space in your files. And brings them all back in, so you'd end up with what looks like a single line file. The reason why we do this is because your browser can load that file much quicker than it can by going through every single line in that file. So for example, we can have a minified file which is one line in length versus a standard CSS file which could possibly be 300 to 400 lines in length. Once we've got this downloaded, we're just going to drop the zip folder straight onto the desktop. From there we can go into the zip folder and then unzip just the dist folder. I'm then going to just simply rename that dist folder because that can form the root of our website. Once I've got that unzipped, the next step is just to create a blank HTML file. Now I'm using Notepad++ for this. You can use different source file editors, so for example Visual Studio Code is also quite a good one to use. Now I'm going to save the file, and I'm going to save the file as index.html. The only reason why I've called it index.html is because most server technologies, so for example Apache, will look for that file as the home page. Now there are different ways you can get your standard or template Bootstrap files. So the way that I'm showing is the way that I find the easiest, and that's to go onto the Bootstrap examples, to view the source of the page and to copy and paste it into your file. Because I've downloaded a distribution version of Bootstrap, that means that everything comes with predefined paths to included files. So an included file could be a CSS file, it could also be a JavaScript file. So what I'm going to do first of all is just remove some of these links and reduce them down so that we're only looking inside the CSS folder. I'll need to do the same with the JS files. So again, the reason why we're doing this is because we're working on our local machine. Once I've shortened down those paths, there are two other things that you'll notice that I'm removing from this file. Those are integrity. Integrity just defines a hash value for the resource, creates a string of characters which are generated uniquely from the contents of that file. So if I download a file, I can use a checksum to ensure that that hasn't been changed. So it's a way of checking that the integrity remains for the file. The other thing that you'll notice that I'm removing is something called a cross-origin resource sharing link, which is shown as cross-origin in the file. The reason why that's in place is to prevent other sites from loading your resources. So this is a requirement for browser security. What it does is it helps us to prevent third-party applications from stealing end-user data. Now an example of a cross-origin link could be, for example, if I load a JavaScript file which then links off to another website. That other website could potentially be stealing our details. This could be things such as credit or debit card details or any other personal information. So once I've tweaked that title tag, the next thing I'm going to do is start to look at adding some standard Bootstrap HTML elements. So the first of those is to add what's called a container. So a container is just a div tag. So div is just standard HTML with the class container, as you can see that I'm adding here. Once I've got my container, I need to make sure it's also closed, and then inside that container I can add in some additional HTML elements. Now these elements are all available on the Bootstrap website, so I'll show you that shortly. But to get started, what we're going to do is we're going to look at columns. Columns allow us to have what the name suggests, which is columns on our page. So much like a newspaper article where you can see multiple columns there, we're going to start off by adding 3 columns. Bootstrap does use a 12 column grid. So what that means is we have 12 available columns to use. We can cross across these. So what I mean by that is, in this example, we're going to have 3 columns, each with 4 inside. So we end up with 12 in total, so 4, 8 and 12. And then what I'll show you just after this is how to create a 2 column grid. So the way to create our grid is to use a simple class which comes as part of Bootstrap. So that is col-md-4 for a 4 column item. So you can now see that I've got 3 columns, so I've indicated these with the text. This is column 1, this is column 2 and this is column 3. Now if I go back to my browser and refresh the page, you'll see that I have 3 sections with this text in. However, they're not displaying as columns. The reason why is because I've actually missed an additional container which should have the class row. So again, row, just like columns, indicates a row where I can group my columns together. You'll notice now that if I refresh my browser after adding that row container around the columns, that you can now see these coming into lines. You can see there's now 3 columns. Below this, I'm going to add another additional 2 columns, this time changing the class from col-md-4 to col-md-6. This theoretically means that I can have 2 columns side by side which would meet up and form the 12 column grid for Bootstrap. When I refresh my browser, you'll see I have a free set of columns and also 2 columns, and that if I reduce the size of my browser, that these are now responsive. So by responsive, what I mean is that when I reduce the size of my browser, or if I'm viewing on a different size screen or mobile device even, that these will fall into place and still display on the screen and not be cut off. That means I've got no left and right scroll, and that the page content still remains visible on any screen or device being used. Now one thing that I haven't done is added an additional style sheet to this file. So the reason why we need to add an additional style sheet is because Bootstrap is a framework. That means that we shouldn't be making any changes to Bootstrap itself. Bootstrap could potentially in the future be updated, which means that we could simply drop their bootstrap.css and bootstrap.js files straight on top of our old or outdated versions of the files. This means that in order to make any changes, we need to create our own CSS file. So in this case, I'm going to create a CSS file called custom.css. It's important that any CSS changes that you now carry out are carried out in this custom.css style sheet. The idea behind the framework is that you build on top of it and don't make changes to it. So in this case, I'm giving my container a custom class called custom-class, and I'm going to use it, give me some padding or a margin at the top of the page so that it shows below the navigation rather than underneath it. The class can be called whatever you want, so in this case I'm going to tweak it and change it to main-container, and that means that it's got a more relevant name, and that can also leave it in place now. One of the great things about Bootstrap is that there's a lot of things that are already made for you. They're using standard HTML and CSS written for us by the Bootstrap team. So in this example, what I've done is gone through the Bootstrap documentation on the Get Bootstrap website. I've clicked on components on the left hand side and then buttons, and you can see all the buttons that are available for us to use. Now it is good practice to use Bootstrap's own components. However, remember Bootstrap is a framework, so that means that you can make changes to it, but you should be doing so in relevant files. So in this case, it will be in our custom.css file where we'll make any changes. Take the time to play with some of these Bootstrap elements and get used to them. You can see in this example here that I'm using what was a button previously. I'm using the same classes and adding these onto an anchor, which means we can create a href or a hyperlink effectively that looks exactly like a button. So that's it for today's video. What I'd suggest you now do is have a look through Bootstrap documentation, have a look through the different components that you can use, and continue to build your web application based on Bootstrap.